Hello viewers and welcome back to Bumblebee. Today's video is about the top 10 reasons the Vietnam War was so terrifying. Reason number 10 will be creepy critters. War held in a jungle is going to provide much more than human enemies. The following information is provided by R.J. Holland, an 11th ACR tank crewman, who states lieutenant in charge would tell him to keep one eye open for Charlie and the other eye open for ferocious little bastards. The giant red ants' nests would hang from trees, and Tank TC would go headfirst into one before he ever even knew it. Holland states that thousands of ferocious ants would be biting and crawling all over you, and while there was bug spray, it would take about 10 minutes for it to work. You'd endure until it did. If you took off your boots for the night, you'd have to turn them upside down and smack them in case a scorpion crawled inside, and their stings could be lethal if not immensely painful. There was also 15-inch centipedes that made a clacking noise as they slithered up your legs and have horrible infectious bites. Slimy, swollen black leeches would stick to brown water sailors as crocodiles stalked them. Similar to that, night patrollers were often snuck up upon by tigers. Then there was the most weirdest things, as stated by Holland, a long vine that would catch onto you, hold you, and not let you go. They're called wait a minute vines because when they get a hold of you, you'd yell out to the others, wait a minute, and get someone to cut it off of you. Then there are the snakes. Holland was never informed of basic training how to identify what was venomous, so seeing any snake meant risk. To quote him, the one we called the two-stepper was supposed to be bad. After being bitten by it, you took 2 steps and apparently dropped dead. We did learn that round-headed snakes are usually okay, but triangle-headed ones are venomous. But if we saw a round-headed snake, we sure as hell didn't pat its head. Reason number 9 is civilian casualty. The US started a war with Vietnam as part of the Cold War effort to prevent the spread of communism across the globe. They had seen North Vietnam's victory on the French and feared the spread into the south state of Vietnam, feeling it weak to resist. The war was fought on Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Laos land. Over 58,000 American troops were killed in Vietnam, with more still not identified. However, American civilians were not killed in the Vietnam War and faced next to no foreign threat. The same cannot be said for the residents of Vietnam. In 1995, their government released its official estimate of people killed during the Vietnam War, as many as 2 million civilians on both sides and some 1,100,000 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong fighters. The US military has estimated between 200,000 and 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers died. Approximately 5 million Vietnamese people were also left wounded or disabled. The United States had flown 3.4 million aircraft sorties, which for those who do not recognize the term, is a combat mission of an individual aircraft. Additionally, the US expended 30 billion pounds of munitions, releasing the equivalent force of 640 big booms. Reason number 8 is the cover-up. The My Lai killing was one of the most horrific incidents of violence committed during the Vietnam War, and an explanation as to how the Viet civilian death toll was so high. The small village of My Lai is located where American intelligence believed a stronghold of the Viet Cong was based during the Vietnam War. At the time, morale amongst the US soldiers, especially in the wake of North Vietnamese-led Tet Offensive, when the Charlie Company, the perpetrating soldiers, had lost some 28 of its members. When the company arrived shortly after dawn in My Lai, led by Lieutenant William Calley, they found no Viet Cong, instead a quiet village of mostly women and seniors preparing breakfast rice. The villagers were rounded up into groups, and despite only finding a few weapons amongst the homes, Calley ordered his men to begin offing the villagers. Women were violated, the elderly butchered, and approximately 500 died before Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson, an Army helicopter pilot on a separate recon mission, flew overhead and saw what was happening. He landed his aircraft between the soldiers and the retreating villagers and threatened to open fire on the American soldiers if they tried to continue. Thompson and his crew flew dozens of survivors to receive medical care. Knowing news of the deaths would cause a scandal, officials higher up in the command of Charlie Company and the 11th Brigade immediately made efforts to downplay the bloodshed. It was outed by the soldier Ron Ridenhour and investigative journalist Seymour Hersh in November of 1969. The revelations of the My Lai caused the American soldiers' morale to plummet even further, as GIs wondered what other atrocities their superiors were concealing. And tragically, they were right to do so. Later investigations have revealed that mass decimation at My Lai was not an isolated incident, having occurred in other villages such as Mai Khi. Then there's the notorious military operation called Speedy Express that killed thousands of Vietnamese civilians in the Mekong Delta, earning the commander of the operation the nickname the Butcher of Delta. Reason number 7 is being far from home, the Vietnam War is known as a wildly unpopular war in American history for a multitude of reasons. One is being a parent during it. Let's look at it from the perspective of living in the 60s and 70s. Vietnam is about 10,000 miles away from mainland US. During the 1960s, there were no cell phones, there was no internet, and a letter could take months to reach across the world. This naturally made our world much, much smaller. Barely any of the average Americans of the time, and even today, had been somewhere near Vietnam. From 1961 to 68, American troops fought in Vietnam, taking approximately 2.7 million men abroad. This was the bloodiest conflict the US has fought since World War II and still is to this date. To get the manpower required, 25% of men were acquired through draft alone, so approximately 648,000. That means as men turned 18, they were required to put their name in for the draft and, if called, to go fight in the military some 10,000 miles away, with no way to contact their families or for their families to contact them while the war stretched on for 10 years. Now think of being a parent, a significant other, a sibling, or a friend to the young men being sent to Vietnam. You can't hear from them, and you won't. You receive all your updates on newspaper headlines that already receive their news delayed from overseas and have to be unsure if the tragic loss of soldiers on the battlefield they describe included your special person. Some soldiers' bodies were never found nor identified, meaning some people never learned the fate of loved ones. Reason number 6 is the Saigon Iron Fist. So when it came time for America to leave Vietnam, it was in haste. This is proven in 1975 when the People's Army of Vietnam captured the city of Saigon and destroyed the airport. In the final stages of the war ending, the Americans in Vietnam evacuated in a panic, abandoned any and all Vietnamese who had served alongside them in a state of immense despair, and they then tried everything in their power to evacuate with their supposed allies. In just one day, the US evacuated over 7,000 people using helicopters in Operation Frequent Wind, which followed the principle of American First's policy. In the vicinity of the US Embassy, which served as the evacuation point, thousands of Vietnamese nationals attempted to climb over the walls and rush towards helicopters in vain. This is when the famous photo of Saigon Iron Fist was taken, a symbol of America's failure in the war that was heavily circulated by media outlets. As seen in the photo, a Vietnamese man is desperately trying to board a loaded departing plane as his friend ushers him, yet an American leans out and delivers a powerful punch to force him off the plane. It struck hard at the proverbial faces of Vietnamese people who had once faithfully served alongside the US military, and also shattered the confidence and loyalty of many who blindly trusted and idolized the US. Reason number 5 is Miss Saigon. Part of what was so devastating about the Iron Fist is that many of those Vietnamese people attempting to board the flights were the wives of the American soldiers. Having lived so long in Vietnam, many young Americans had relations or even full-out marriages with Vietnamese women. When the Americans retreated in 1975, these families were forced to be left behind. According to an article in the New York Times in 1984, the estimated number of American offspring being raised by single mothers in Vietnam ranged between 25,000 and 40,000. During the US retreat, soldiers were given orders not to bring their local families back, even on threat of death, and it was reported soldiers had jointly written letters and petitions beforehand to the government requesting permission to bring their families back to the US and were still denied. Scenes captured by CBS News showed heartbreaking moments of American soldiers parting with Vietnamese families who were left to be marginalized. These families were seen by the Vietnamese people to be betrayals, signs of the enemy. The renowned musical Miss Saigon tells the tragic story of a Vietnamese woman who falls in love with an American soldier. However, the soldier does return to the US and gets remarried. Eventually, the woman takes her life. This tragic story is not an isolated incident, but represents the plight of an entire generation. In the 1980s, under strong public pressure in both Vietnam and America, the US finally enacted legislation allowing the families of American soldiers to immigrate to the US. Reason number 4 is black and orange. Apart from the families left behind by the Americans after the Vietnam War, there was also the legacies of the orange and black horrors. Orange is the name for a toxic property used by the US during the war, claiming endless casualties during it. 70 million liters were used over a period of 9 years, causing direct or indirect deaths of over 400,000 people and becoming a source of major environmental contamination in Vietnam, causing illness, disabilities, and cancers, which in turn caused mass financial duress. The ecological environment in the southern regions of Vietnam also suffered catastrophic damage, with 20% of the rainforest and 30% of the mangroves dying, and over 3,000 villages being directly contaminated. In 2014, Vietnamese nationals initiated a collective lawsuit that is demanding compensation from American companies for the producing of orange. Black, meanwhile, refers to the big boom weapons, as the US dropped tens of millions across more than 300,000 100,000 square kilometers of Vietnamese land. However, not all of them boomed on impact due to quality control issues. This has posed a serious threat for the decades since the Vietnam War, as they now sit undetonated, waiting for something to set them off. Statistics show that over the course of several decades, more than 20,000 people in Vietnam have been killed or injured by these long-buried weapons. Reason number 3 is tactics of war. The reason it was so difficult for either side of the war to gain advantage was due to the use of what can only be called fighting dirty. Vietnam was not a land war where you captured it and now it was yours. Inside, the large populations of Vietnamese people, many of whom were hoping the war would be passed by them, the Viet Cong blended in. They were highly skilled in hit and runs, ambushes, and other tactics that allowed them to blend in with the civilian population, pop out, do some damage, then blend in once more, making it difficult for American and South Vietnamese forces to identify and defeat the proper enemies. This wasn't just a physical warfare, but psychological, increasing soldier paranoia and feeding into their ability to rationalize such heinous acts as the My Lai killings. The more Americans violated and killed the neutral Vietnamese, the more the Vietnamese became sympathizers, or actually sided with the Viet Cong. The Vietnam War dragged on for years with peace for the Americas just out of reach. The VC and the North Vietnamese regulars were going in to inflict as much punishment and death on the Americans to force their withdrawal from Vietnam, and they did. Reason number 2 is tunnel ratting. Fight fire with fire, more accurately dirty fighting with dirty fighting. The Viet Cong were crafty in their ways, especially being on home territory, which gives them the advantage. The Viet Cong developed a tunnel network that provided shelter, supply, and planning spaces within easy striking distance. This needed to be rivaled somehow, especially with the Viet Cong tunnels having over a 20-year advantage, so it meant American soldiers needed to get in the ground as well. And an unconventional group of small and scraggly Americans known as the Tunnel Rats was formed in 1966. Deliberate tunnel clearance fell to this group of volunteer infantrymen and engineers. The tiny tunnels, most only measuring 2 by 3 feet, meant soldiers could only enter one at a time. No two tunnel complexes were ever the same layout, stretching thousands of feet with sections joining at various angles. The job also required a special kind of mental toughness, as crawling for hours in claustrophobic darkness, expecting mortal danger that could break down even the bravest man. The job also demanded lightning-quick reflexes and no hesitation. Confrontations with venomous snakes or Viet Cong often occurred at hand-to-hand range. They had to travel light and abandon all their helmets, equipment, water canteens, even masks, entering with a hand arm, a flashlight, and a lot of guts. As Harold Roper, a tunnel rat from the early days of 1966, recalled, "I felt more fear that I've ever come close to feeling before or since." Reason number 1 is what Harold was afraid of: booby traps. The Viet Cong built booby traps in most of the tunnel systems, meaning that the brave tunnel rats could expect booms, poisons, punji stake traps, tethered venomous snakes, and more. These traps could also be found above ground, but with a few others added in. Punji sticks are traps made of sharpened bamboo sticks, often smeared with urine, feces, and other infection-causing gunk. Like in the Crash Bandicoot video games, the VC would dig a hole and then put the sticks in the bottom, cover it with a thin frame. The victim would put his foot through and fall onto the spikes below. Snake pits, yes, like in Indiana Jones. Viet Cong members would carry bamboo pit vipers, aka two-step snakes, in their packs to kill anyone who searched through them, or to tie them to bamboo and hide them throughout their tunnel complexes. The mace was a tripwire trap and may have been the worst of all. Once the wire was triggered, a 24-inch metal or wooden ball with spikes welded onto it weighing 40 pounds or more would swing down from a tree, and I'm sure you can imagine the carnage. Honorable mention goes to the tiger trap, which was similar to this one, but instead of a swinging ball, it was a man-sized plank full of metal spikes that fell from above, weighed with bricks. Thanks once again for tuning in to Bumblebee. If you enjoy war videos, maybe check out our last warfare video on the top 10 historical conquests of Alexander the Great. While you're at it, subscribe to The Hive for more of our regular video updates and drop a like. I'll see you around.